Well, as I was saying, I've tried to summarize, bring together, synthesize, and elaborate so I can give you everything already digested, everything that I consider fundamental to understand and grasp. Today, you're going to learn things that many psychologists don't know because it's not something that's taught in college, or at least not generally in degree programs in Spain. Because in general, the psychology that's taught in our country is more focused on the symptom, on discomfort, on changing behavior. And well, as a psychologist, what interests me is understanding the reason behind things, where everything comes from, and making deeper, more structural changes. Beyond, well, just correcting a symptom, a discomfort, and changing a behavior. That's why perhaps universal concepts arise. They're quite complex, dense. You already know that my classes aren't usually simple. Those of you who attended the previous class I gave here on YouTube, which was in November when we talked about self-knowledge, you already saw that these classes are a bit dense, a bit intense. As I said, I've tried to simplify it as much as possible, but anyway, I recommend that you pay close attention, and if you can, take notes, write things down, whatever helps you learn. To remember and to reflect on it, because this is one of those subjects. You hear it, you read it once, and you say, okay, it makes sense, I get it, I like it, but the more you think about it, the more you reflect on it, the more you carry it with you. EM. Let's say it sinks in more, right? That little seed grows and keeps blossoming and bearing fruit. So I recommend that you take this talk with you. All right, in case someone doesn't know me, they've put a presentation here. I'm Claudia Nicolasa. I'm a clinical psychologist specialized in personality and relationships. And well, I have a book. In case you haven't read it, I highly recommend it because honestly, it's pretty cool. And well, my goal is for as many people as possible to get to know themselves, to understand why they are the way they are, and to have the tools and guidelines to make the necessary changes in their lives and in their relationships. And for once, well, they can enjoy themselves and their lives. Because I myself have spent most of my life trapped in that darkness or confusion, not understanding what's happening to you, why you feel this way, or why you are who you are. And well, with a certain pessimism, about the future, about life, and about what was waiting for me. And things and life and the way they are can really change. The way we feel about it can change a lot if we learn psychology. So my goal is to give others what I would have liked to receive a little earlier. Let's begin the conference, class, or whatever you'd like to call it. I've called it a conference because it's not so much a didactic class about concepts, but more about trying to change the approach, or something like that. How do we see self-esteem socially? Because I think, as we'll see now, there are quite a few conceptions. Mistaken ones that basically lead us to do things that not only don't help us, but can even harm how we feel about ourselves. That's why it says here, right? A deep relational psychological perspective, because that's my way of working with psychology and how I want to share with you what self-esteem is. Okay? Is everything okay? All set? Everything good in the chat? Let me check here for a moment. Thank you, Luz Marina. Thank you, thank you. Are you into it? Are you interested? Do you think what I'm sharing is cool? Thank you, Anu. I've spent a year and a half isolated after a toxic, psychologically abusive breakup, and you've brought me a lot of light. Well, I'm glad about the second part. And as for the first, I hope that little by little, as you said, you find that light. All right, ready? Great. Let's do this. Very good. First of all, I want to ask you what self-esteem means to you. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? I mean, what concepts come to mind? Maybe what comes to mind is, I don't know, security, confidence, maybe success, well-being, I don't know. What comes to your mind when I ask you what self-esteem is? Your value as a person to yourself. Love, the value we give ourselves, happiness, personal value, self-knowledge, feeling good about yourself, confidence, your concept as a person, believing in and respecting yourself, the way you see yourself, right? The perception we have about ourselves, okay, right? Exactly. When we talk about self-esteem, that's what comes to mind, right? The way you see yourself, the confidence you experience, self-assurance, how you treat yourself, right? And indeed, all these words you've mentioned have a strong connection with self-esteem, because generally they're the result, right, of the self-esteem we have. Depending on my self-esteem, I will experience more or less confidence, more or less security. I will have one image or another of myself. I will treat myself better or worse. And this is one of the main ideas I want you to take away from this class. Self-esteem is not so much what we think about ourselves. It's not how we define ourselves. It's not the image we have, but rather something much deeper and almost hidden, right? Well, you've already mentioned a few things here, right? Some of the things you think self-esteem is, or that you associate with it, trusting yourself, right? Confidence and so on. And if we look closely, most of the concepts or words that come to mind when we think about self-esteem are what here in this iceberg are above the water, what is visible, right? Which is more about behavior, right? What thoughts do I have about myself? What self-image do I have? What behaviors do I engage in day to day? What relationships do I have, right? How are we perceived, right? From the outside, that facade, right? That success. In fact, there are many people who from the outside may seem very successful, very self-confident, who have a lot of self-esteem. But when they step off that stage, so to speak, we can see that their self-esteem is very fragile. There is a very fragile identity that wavers, that is very vulnerable, that depends a lot on what happens in the moment. Really, what interests us today is everything that is in the hidden part of the iceberg. All those things that apparently we often don't associate with self-esteem, okay? For example, what we allow in our relationships, how we evaluate what we do and what happens to us, who we interact with, right? All of that, how we treat our body too. All of those are things that we often don't take into account when we're evaluating self-esteem, and that's what's important. So if we're going to try to understand where that sense of self-worth really comes from, how it's built during our development, in other words, of course, we're going to talk about childhood. Let's see what happens when certain parts of ourselves, let's say, have to be hidden, discarded, or rejected in order to maintain the bond, to feel accepted, loved, valued, and worthy. And we're also going to look at how many behaviors or strategies we use to feel valuable and how often they end up having the opposite effect, okay? We're going to look at things that seem like self-esteem, but really aren't too, okay? Okay. A phrase that, I want you to remember from this first slide is that self-esteem isn't seen in what you think about yourself. That is, it's not something conscious, it's not something rational, but rather it's seen in how you inhabit yourself. And that's why many people believe they have self-esteem because they have a certain image of themselves. But in reality, if you start to analyze how they live and how they treat themselves, they don't have self-esteem. And then there are people who believe they have low self-esteem because they're aware of their insecurities, their flaws, their defects. But in reality, they have good self-esteem because after all, they treat themselves well. We're going to go over this during the class, okay? So during today's class, I want you not only to understand what I'm sharing on a theoretical level, but also to try to apply it to yourself, to your own life. I want you to constantly think, how might this show up in me? How might I express it? Try to place it within yourself so that as the next days go by, you remember this and start gathering information. Okay? All right. As I was saying, there are many people who might seem to have self-esteem from the outside, right? And here I've given you a metaphor of a house whose facade might look very modern, elegant, clean, and impressive. It gives off a sense of security, right? A lot of solidity, perfection, success, right? It seems like a super valuable house. But we know that the facade isn't everything. Maybe, no matter how beautiful it looks on the outside, the foundations might be poorly built, maybe they're neglected, maybe they're fragile. Therefore, no matter how good the facade is, if something happens like, I don't know, a flood, a hurricane, I don't know, a small tectonic plate movement, the house collapses, right? And this is what we call conditional self-esteem, right? It's that self-esteem or that sense of self-worth that's okay. It's correct as long as it meets certain conditions, expectations, requirements, right? In terms of how others see us. Some achievements, social acceptance, validation, some successes, right? Each person has their own standards. But on the inside, that part of true self-esteem, that part beneath the iceberg, is fragile. So at the slightest thing that happens, maybe, I don't know, a criticism, a rejection, a failure, a loss, any situation that makes you feel vulnerable, lost, confused, that's when we discover that beneath the facade, there wasn't a solid structure. Okay? Is this facade, this metaphor making sense? Clave and his houses. Yes, yes, totally. I always use houses to explain a lot of things about psychology. Yes, yes, I love it. I love that metaphor. Yes. Right? And for many people, even if they don't realize it, their self-worth depends on meeting certain conditions, right? As long as those conditions are met, the person feels good about themselves. But when those conditions are no longer met, self-esteem collapses because it was based on something external, on something that changes, right? On the other hand, in contrast to conditional self-esteem, we have mature self-esteem, which is the goal of this class, for us to understand what mature self-esteem is. I want us to move away a bit from that social idea of having a lot or a little self-esteem or high or low self-esteem. I want us to understand it more as having mature self-esteem or fragile self-esteem. Solid self-esteem, fragile self-esteem, okay? Let's try to see it as not something you have or don't have or something you have in large or small amounts, but rather as something more qualitative. That is to say, what is the quality of that self-esteem that I have? Yes? Do you understand this shift from thinking in terms of a lot or a little, good or bad, and instead understanding the quality, those structures we talked about as the foundations? If it's of good quality, right? A house can have many structures, but what matters is that it's solid, high quality, and well built. Okay. Well, that mature self-esteem means being able to support yourself even when things go wrong. Yes? In being able to make mistakes without feeling like you are a mistake, a failure, or someone negligent. It's about daring yourself, and it's okay if it doesn't work out. It's about allowing yourself to suffer. It's about being aware of your limitations, your mistakes, your insecurities, without letting that define you as a person, right? In the end, the facade works when conditions are favorable, right? I mean, when the weather is nice, for example, right? When the weather is nice, we say, what a beautiful house, right? How healthy, how strong, how valuable this house is, right? But a mature self-esteem, whether the weather is good or bad, endures. Even if it doesn't look as shiny, luxurious, or modern as the one next to it, right? What matters to us is what endures. That's why I was telling you that there are people who think they have low self-esteem simply because they're aware of their flaws, or they don't shine as much as other people who take such good care of their appearance, or they accept going through periods of insecurity or pain, right? Because socially, we believe that having self-esteem means always being okay, or always having a splendid image of yourself, or always being on top. Okay. Okay. So once we have understood what the difference is between this mature self-esteem and that fragile, conditional, superficial self-esteem, etc., let's talk about how self-esteem is built. And this is where, for me, it gets interesting. Okay? So let's pay attention to what's coming next. Okay, here you go. How does self-esteem originate? Vale. Before I explain anything to you, what comes to mind when you see this image of an adult looking in the mirror and seeing a child? Don't read, don't cheat. I see that the chat is a little bit delayed, so everything goes back to mom and dad, their childhood, the inner child. Okay, this is very important, okay, that we understand this. Self-esteem is not a rational opinion. It's not something you're consciously aware of, okay? That's why it's complicated for people to really understand if they have good or bad self-esteem, in quotes. Because it's not something rational, it's not a concept, it's not a thought, it's something more experiential, it's more a way of being in the world, it's something more unconscious. I'll explain it now, okay? When we talk about self-esteem from a relational perspective, we mean that we have to go back quite a bit to those early stages of development, those first years of life when the foundations of the house are being built. Yes, that stage before you even knew that you were you. I don't know if you remember when you were little. I remember being about 2 years old or so, looking at myself in the mirror and saying, oh, this is me, right? Like realizing that just as my mom is my mom, I am also a person, right? I am me. I mean, we're not aware that we are a person from the moment we're born. In fact, when we're born, you probably know that we're in symbiosis with our mother, right? We don't really distinguish between ourselves and our mother in some way. We're not aware that we are a person with a self, with an identity, right? The baby doesn't know who they are. They can't say they're a baby. They don't know how to describe themselves. They don't know how to define their abilities or their attributes. What the baby has is hunger, is sleepiness, is fear, is nervousness. It's a need for contact, it's joy, it's unregulated emotions. That's what the baby has. They don't have a concept of identity. What they have are physiological needs and emotional needs. Okay, do you understand this? Yes? Okay. So what happens? Every time you, when you were a baby, had those physiological needs, those emotional needs, you received information according to the response you were given, right? How do they help regulate you when you're overwhelmed? When you're afraid, how do they calm you? When you feel alone, how do they comfort you? All of that is what gives you information on an unconscious level, right? That is, there are things in our memory that we don't remember, and all of that comes largely from that time. So what happens? In the end, as I was saying, the baby isn't aware of their identity, of being a subject, but they are receiving information about how the world treats them. That is, before you know who you are and before you have a self-concept, you have information about how others see you and how others treat you. So, do we understand that the experience, the relational aspect, and how I am treated by the world comes before identity? I mean, let's realize how significant this is and how it allows us to understand so many things in psychology, right? That's why we say that self-esteem starts out as a relational experience, meaning with others, before it becomes an intrapsychic experience, meaning with myself. With this, we're already starting from a major misconception, which is that whenever we think about self-esteem, we see it as something totally individual, like I have low self-esteem, or I need to improve my self-esteem, right? As if it were something completely individual, just you with yourself, and that it only depends on you and that you have to work on yourself, right? With this, I don't mean to say that there aren't things we can do ourselves to improve it, because of course, that's what we're also going to look at in this class. But it's very important for us to understand that self-esteem is relational before it's intrapsychic, meaning it's something with others before it's something with myself. Okay? All right, when the baby sees that their emotional and physiological needs are seen, understood, validated, and responded to, what's called basic trust is formed. Okay? If you want to look for more information about the concept, again, basic trust is very interesting if you want to explore it. Here, since we'll focus on self-esteem rather than the baby or mom, I don't want to go into it too much. But basically, it's an implicit feeling, meaning unconscious, that my internal states are well received by others, that my needs are not excessive, that I'm not a burden to others, that I can exist and express what I want and what I need without putting the relationship at risk, that I can show myself as I am and that I won't be rejected for it, right? I'm sure you've seen it. There are people who are calm. When they interact with others, they know that if they want or feel something, others will listen and understand them. While there are other people who walk on eggshells with insecurity, right? With fear, thinking that anything could put the relationship at risk. No, this is what we call basic trust. It's closely related to attachment. I'm sure this concept is already more familiar to you, right? Of course, the problem arises when the relationship with these caregivers can be invalidating. It can be ambivalent, it can be unstable, unpredictable. This is when what we call relational trauma starts to appear. And I want to make it clear that when we talk about trauma, psychologists aren't just referring to big, terrifying, or dramatic events, but it can also be something more subtle and cumulative, right? I mean, actually, I need to make a video about a very interesting study I'm looking at on the origin of borderline personality disorder. What they're seeing is that what has the most influence isn't really big traumas or major events. That too, but also it's that caregiver who doesn't respond to the child's need for emotional regulation. I'll make a YouTube video about this since it's really interesting, but just so you know, it can be more painful. Insufficient, inconsistent, and invalidating care in daily life can be more painful than a single major trauma, okay? So what happens here? And now we're getting into self-esteem, okay? I hope you're enjoying the conference and that it's not too much information, okay? Let me know. What happens? In this process, we should remember that human beings, especially when we're babies, are wired to bond, to connect, to hold on to others. Therefore, I will shape myself around whatever works to attract that person who is important to me, who gives me security, who gives me connection. And what happens? In the end, I unconsciously start learning which aspects of myself, which behaviors, which needs are accepted, welcomed, and valued. And those that cause rejection, create distance, create separation, and therefore put the connection at risk, and therefore put me at risk. And well, when that happens, in the end, a person's psyche has two forces, let's say, that fight against each other. One is, I am this way, I have these needs, I have these behaviors, these emotions, but on the other hand, I have this need to connect with others. So this clashes because there are parts of me that create separation, distance, remoteness from my caregiver. Okay. So what do you think happens when I see that the person I depend on pulls away when I show certain behaviors and emotions? What do you think happens? Okay, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you. I really like interacting with the chat, but for some reason it's very delayed. I imagine there are people who join in later and you start not showing them, you stop doing those behaviors, you stop showing off, you change your behavior to please them. I like it, I like it. Well, today you're going to learn what the technical term is for what you're describing, writing about, which is what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? Okay. Okay. What's happening is what we call splitting, okay? Splitting basically consists of this. Well, it's a defense mechanism that divides internally what I perceive as acceptable and what I perceive as unacceptable, dangerous, and so on, right? In simpler words, yes, I notice through all my daily interactions with my family that there are aspects of my personality and my spontaneous needs that are not well received. And that gradually creates tension, danger, distance, and loneliness for me. What I end up doing without realizing it is pushing those parts of myself away, right? As we see here in this metaphor, right? With the puzzle, how the puzzle goes from being complete to having little pieces that I start discarding because I see they're not acceptable, right? Let's remember that my self-esteem is built through my relationships. And if I see that in my first relationships, those parts are not well received, I shape myself and build my identity around only those parts that are well received. But as you can imagine, no matter how much I discard those parts of myself, they don't disappear. They stay in my mind, but somehow they remain tagged with danger, rejection, and so on. And that's how it goes. And that's how we build that conditional self-esteem we talked about earlier, right? Also, take a look at this image I've shown you. What do we see, right? How that fragile foundation supports so much weight from all those conditions, right? I'm only worthy if people like me. I'm only worthy if I'm strong. I'm only worthy if I don't disappoint. Everyone has their own conditions. Some have more than others. Some people have more fragile self-esteem, others less. But when it's built on all these conditions, in the end, this fragile structure supports a lot of weight and can easily collapse, right? So in the end, well, consciously, the person only identifies with the parts that have been preserved, right? The ones that haven't been pushed away. For example, it's very common for someone to come to a session and say, no, I don't get angry, I'm always fine, everything seems fine to me, right? The person has rationally constructed an identity around, I don't get angry, I don't feel anger, everything is fine for me. Why? Because most likely they have pushed away that part of themselves that shows anger when they don't like something because it wasn't accepted. I don't know why, yes? So that part of them, the part that gets angry, is somehow pushed away, set aside, denied. And that brings us problems, right? More examples besides the I never get angry. It's like, I like to do everything on my own, you know? I don't like to ask for help. Is it this? I mean, do we really believe that a person is just born not liking to ask for help? Or maybe they dislike showing vulnerability? Is a person just born like that? No, that comes from somewhere. So of course, what happens is that little by little, the person starts to feel valuable, not just for existing as a human being, just as they are, but they feel valuable as long as they meet those conditions. When they manage to determine, when they manage to maintain that version they have of themselves, right? I'm going to backtrack a little. I've taken parts of myself that I feel aren't well received by others, and I only keep what's appropriate, acceptable. I identify with that, and I feel good as long as I can maintain that version of myself. But in the moments when I can't maintain that version of myself, everything goes into crisis. Like when we talked about that house with the facade. For example, someone who says, I never get angry, everything is fine, I'm very calm. It's impossible to go your whole life without getting angry, and it can have negative consequences. Imagine someone having a fit of rage one day because they can't take it anymore. Well, that clashes with their image, with the positive image they have of themselves, right? With that identity on which their self-esteem depends. They're likely to have a crisis. Just like the person who doesn't want to feel vulnerable and never asks for help, and then there's a crisis they can't solve on their own and they have to ask for help. Well, maybe they'll fall into depression. Okay? And in the end, when life leads us to bring out these parts of ourselves that we have split off and rejected, we feel a deep anguish. Because in some way, I am being in the present what I once labeled as highly dangerous in the past. That's why sometimes we see people who overreact to things that are just human, right? I don't know if you've ever seen someone start crying and they've experienced it as something horrible, painful, embarrassing, degrading. They've wanted to hide it, right? And you think, come on, it's normal for this to affect you, right? Well, if the person is reacting in such an exaggerated way, it's not just because they don't like asking for help. It's because their psyche has labeled that as something, well, something despicable, something shameful, something to reject. And when you connect with that part of yourself, you experience a deep anguish. And that's when the house falls down, that superficial facade we've seen. Because in the end, that fear of losing your worth is being triggered. That fear of no longer being acceptable and lovable, which puts your whole identity into crisis. Okay? Is everything clear? Are you following? Questions will be at the end, okay? Because I'm sure a lot of doubts and questions will come up that will be answered during the class, and that way we won't interrupt the flow, and I won't get distracted either. And well, that's also why we see that there are many people who spend years trying to improve their self-esteem without succeeding, because what they do is follow the typical tricks like talk to yourself more kindly, love yourself more, acquire this or that skill, right? We've been taught that improving self-esteem is like adding more things, right? Like incorporating better habits, adding new skills, talking to yourself more kindly. All of that is great, and it's really good and important. But none of that will help us if we keep rejecting those parts of ourselves, because that causes suffering, and because every time we connect with those parts, we fall apart. Right? Thank you. Now we're going to keep looking at it. Okay? So as you can see, here it is. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I think you can. Here we have this real self, which is, well, what you are as a human being. It's that living and complex experience of being yourself with your strengths, your limitations, your abilities, your mistakes, your independence, your vulnerability. It's you completely, with your light and your darkness, which absolutely everyone has. No one is perfect and no one does everything perfectly, even though we always try to show only our good side. So that's your real self. And the ideal self is that version of yourself that you have identified with. That version of yourself that remains when you have expelled those parts we saw before, the ones that weren't accepted. It's the version you feel you should reach in order to feel valuable, to feel acceptable, to feel lovable, right? When we talk about wanting to reach our ideal self in order to feel lovable, many people will say, no, I do it for myself because I want to feel good about myself. Well, let's remember that the relationship with yourself is a derivative of your relationships with others. So if you feel that in order to love yourself and be comfortable with yourself, you have to be a certain way, it's because you learned through relationships that you were loved when you were that way. So, well, it's still something relational, even if it's something you only experience with yourself, right? Even if there's that real narrative of, no, I do it for myself, you do it for yourself, but why, right? As we've seen, there's a relational learning behind it, okay? And so, as we can see, the ideal self isn't something that comes out of nowhere. It's something that has been built relationally. It's something we've been shaping based on what we've seen that worked, that was working. That's how it is. Everything we see that works for us in relationships, in society, we reinforce it, we increase it, and little by little, we make it more a part of our identity. There's no problem with having an ideal self in the sense of having goals, having ideals. I'm the first one to believe in wanting to improve yourself, in wanting to go further, in growing. There's nothing wrong with having ideals, with wanting to improve things about yourself, with wanting to change. The problem is when that ideal self is so rigid, so big, so unreal, that next to it, your real self looks like something childish, something tiny, something fragile, something absurd, right? I mean, when the distance between the real self and the ideal self is so big, the person always lives with an underlying sense of anxiety and shame, with a constant feeling of inadequacy, right? Instead of feeling like a person, I feel like a project of a person, right? I'm not going to be happy and I'm not going to be okay until I reach this ideal that I have, right? Right? Am I not, how can I say it, like throwing little darts? I don't know if I'm hitting you emotionally with what I'm saying. I don't want to be too harsh either. Well, the greater the distance between the real self and the ideal self, every time life makes us connect with those parts of ourselves that we've pushed away, we experience it with tremendous anguish because it's like, wow, I've been vulnerable, I've shown my emotions, and I've asked for help. This isn't how I'm supposed to be. This doesn't happen consciously, right? It's just how it's experienced. Then I'm overwhelmed by a deep sense of shame and a feeling of, I'm not being the person I'm supposed to be. I'm a failure, right? I'm an embarrassment. And well, as always, we have here the dear defense mechanisms that are there to somehow try to protect us from that shame that appears when I see that my real self is very far from my ideal self, right? Each person has their extended parts, each person has their own type of shame, and therefore each person uses different defense mechanisms. So this shame, let's say, doesn't collapse, overwhelm, or bring them down, right? There are people who are always trying to be in control so they don't feel vulnerable. There are people who always want to be disconnected from what's happening in their lives and in their relationships so they never feel fragile and don't experience pain. Some people inflate their egos and self-esteem to avoid connecting with their true selves. Con su verdadero sentimiento. There are people who are always being accommodating and adapting to others so they don't have to face that anxiety, right? And that fear of loneliness and being abandoned. Each person has their own defense, but the important thing is that the defense itself isn't the problem. I mean, the problem isn't that someone is arrogant. The problem isn't that someone is controlling. The problem isn't that someone is avoidant. The problem is that we're not seeing what that defense is protecting them from. Which parts have been split off and are producing that shame, and what is happening with that shame that they're trying to avoid. I hope all of this is becoming clear. All right. This brings us to what low self-esteem looks like. We've already seen, right, that we learn how we have to be based on how we've been treated in those relationships. From there, we build our extended identity, seeing parts that have been rejected or not reinforced. And the more extended I am, the more I've rejected parts of myself and inflated that ideal self, the more chronic feelings of inadequacy, inferiority, shame, and failure I carry with me. Okay. So here we have the three most common profiles in which we can see low self-esteem. The first one would be the one who shrinks. I think that's the one most people have in mind when they think of someone with low self-esteem, right? A person who is aware that they have low self-esteem, who feels inadequate, who feels incapable, who finds it hard to put themselves out there, who finds it hard to ask for things, who finds it hard to relate to others, set boundaries, or stand up for their needs. Let's say it's the one that, quote unquote, you see them and you know they have low self-esteem. And it's the one that, let's say, society sees in the worst light, like, wow, you really have low self-esteem. When in reality, out of these three profiles I've shown you here, it's actually the healthiest or the most preserved because it's the one that's most aware of what's happening inside. While others are not in touch with their shame, with their low self-esteem, with their fragility. Therefore, it's much easier for this person to be aware of what's happening to them, to ask for help, to go to therapy, to improve, to work on themselves. Whereas with the others, you probably see them and don't realize that they have low self-esteem. You think they're in better mental health than the other person. First, but it's much less likely that they'll ask for help, be aware, and be able to heal. The second prototype, which more closely resembles narcissism, is the one who inflates themselves, right? It's that person who, since they can't tolerate that feeling of inferiority, of insufficiency, and of shame, what they create is an inflated identity, right? Which tries to compensate for how they really feel. And therefore, they don't accept any kind of failure or criticism or confrontation. Because in reality, their self-esteem is very fragile and depends on that inflated alter ego. So anything can bring them down. And that's why we have, those typical narcissistic attitudes of wanting to put themselves above others and so on and so forth. But anyway, I think we already know quite a lot about narcissism here. There's no need for us to talk about it. And thirdly, we have the one who adapts. This is a person whose way of managing that insufficiency, that shame, and that low self-esteem. It's not about shrinking away, nor about making themselves bigger, but rather about constantly molding themselves, adapting to what is expected of them. It's like a transformer, right? We could say. She puts on the mask depending on what the situation calls for, right? Here we can see people who, depending on who they're with, change their ideology, their taste, their way of being, their way of speaking, their appearance. It's something very common. For example, in borderline personalities, we have that rather diffuse identity that changes depending on the person they're with. In the end, as we were saying, each person has their own defenses, their own way of managing discomfort, inadequacy, and shame. And here we can see three very common ways or three very common profiles. And with the third profile, you don't need to be borderline. This is actually quite common. With borderlines, things can be taken to the extreme. What happens to these people is that since they're always adapting to what others expect from them, well, over time, let's say they disconnect from their own needs, from what they want, and so on. It's also very common in dependent people, which probably came to your mind. Okay. A little sip to drink some water. Okay. Underlying these three profiles, we have three very common mechanisms that we usually don't identify at first as low self-esteem. I remember that last year, I was invited to some science communication awards or something like that, and I was on stage with two other science communicators. I didn't know them. And during a Q&A session, a girl from the audience asked another person who was on stage, "What do you do to manage the ups and downs, when it comes to creating content?" This girl said that sometimes in the morning she would wake up thinking she was awesome. Sorry for the language, that she was awesome. She believed she could handle anything, would do great, crush it, and felt very motivated. But then in the afternoon, she'd start thinking she was worthless, wouldn't make it, had nothing interesting to say, was stupid, and so on. And the question for this science communicator was, how did she manage this instability, or these emotional roller coasters? And this science communicator replied that it was normal, that it happens to everyone. And then she added that since she's a Pisces, I think it was, that's very Pisces too, right? I couldn't stay quiet. I grabbed the mic and said, with all due respect, I know the goal is to help, but that's not normal. We shouldn't normalize it. And if it happens to you, you should address it. Yes? And what this tells us about is the oscillation of the self. Okay? I'm going to try to explain it very well. There are many people who, let's go back, have these parts of the self that are not integrated, right? There are many people who don't have an integrated identity, meaning their mind isn't able to understand that you can be someone strong and at the same time vulnerable. You can be someone capable and at the same time have limitations. You can be someone brave but at the same time have fears, right? Right? Many people have this black and white mindset, especially nowadays. We see it a lot socially. But what this leads us to is that when I do something well, my identity swings. I start to think that I am, well, a champion, that I can handle everything, that I'm super strong, but then I make a mistake and I think I'm a mess, that I can't handle anything. Yes. It's normal for what happens in our lives to affect us a little, right? Obviously, if you all don't like today's class at all, then I might experience insecurities and doubts. But if you don't like today's class, I'm not going to start thinking I'm a terrible psychologist, I'm a really bad communicator, I'm worthless, I should quit. No, I'll think, geez, maybe I need to improve my communication skills. Maybe I need to better understand what people want, right? I mean, I can accept that I'm a good professional, but that I can make mistakes, right? On the other hand, there are many people with these self-esteem issues whose identity fluctuates. Why is that? Because they haven't been able to integrate all those parts within themselves, and that's why they swing between opposite states. And that's why many people think they're emotionally unstable or that they need to learn to regulate their emotions, when in reality, what we're seeing is that their self-esteem problem is manifesting in this fluctuating self. And I see this quite often. Some days people feel they can do anything. Other days they lie in bed depressed, thinking they won't achieve anything. Well, the healthiest thing in terms of identity is to be at a more intermediate or more stable point. To say, hey, look, I'm a person with strengths and limitations. Sometimes I'll do well, sometimes I'll do badly, but neither a positive comment will make me feel like a pop star, nor will a negative comment make me feel like a crumb on the floor. Okay. Another behavior or mechanism, which is very common in people with low self-esteem and fits quite well with the second profile, is the counterphobic attitude, okay? This is another concept that if you're interested, I invite you to look up on your own, because I can't spend too much time on it either. But basically, behind people we see who never seem afraid, who never doubt, who are always super strong, who are always at their best, and who throw themselves into everything. From the outside, it may seem like they are people with a lot of self-esteem, with a lot of self-confidence, but in reality, what we're seeing is not someone who has managed to integrate their vulnerability, work on it, and overcome it, but rather what we're seeing is a person who has organized themselves around constantly fighting against their vulnerability, proving to themselves that they are above it. In other words, this is a person who is so vulnerable that their life is constantly based on proving to themselves that they're not vulnerable. By taking on challenges and throwing themselves into things, they prove to themselves they're not vulnerable, right? Not everyone who does extreme sports has this counterphobia behind it, but it's common for them to have it, right? Another very interesting profile is, I don't know if you know the typical guy who has been rejected many times when trying to flirt with girls. who has felt very insecure, who didn't have social skills. And maybe suddenly one day something clicks and he says, well, now I'm going to prove to myself that I'm not insecure. And he starts trying to flirt with every girl he can, becoming super arrogant, right? It's like in some way trying to completely change who I am to run away from how I really feel. And I see this a lot with, well, people who take flirting courses and so on. They create these kinds of profiles, right? Counterphobic. And well, the mechanism that's so common behind the person who adapts is this false self, right? It's about building myself a persona, an identity, a character that I feel will be accepted. And what happens then? That I can't always maintain it, right? To begin with, because things happen in life. Second, because real relationships require us to show ourselves as we truly are and to let go of those masks. And also because in the end, the feeling of emptiness, of lack of authenticity and disconnection ends up weighing on us. This very often takes the form of a crisis in people who, for example, reach 40 or 50 years old and realize that their whole life they have shaped themselves with this false self around what others expect and what society expects. And they realize that they no longer know who they are, what they need, what they want, and they feel that the life they have built is not really theirs, right? And a very, very characteristic symptom of these profiles is what we call the lack of object constancy. I encourage you to study this interesting concept if you're interested. And it's that these are people who, as long as the other person is there, are able to hold up the mask. Because when the other person is there, there's an identity to perform, right? But when there's no one else, when they're alone, that mask falls off, and that's when that emptiness comes out, when in some way they break down emotionally, right? Do you know someone who's fine around others because they know who to be in those situations? It's like they have their role defined, their part defined, but when they're alone, that's when their mind can finally relax, they can take off that mask, but that's when that emptiness appears and that question of who am I when there's no one else who is looking at me. Okay, it's very interesting to see how low self-esteem, or rather fragile self-esteem, manifests differently in each person. That's also a bit so that we can broaden our perspective and see beyond thinking that a person with low self-esteem is just someone insecure, fragile, like this one here, right? We see it appears in other ways. I'll check the chat because I can get carried away talking here. On top of that, carrying the mask is exhausting. Exactly, it's exhausting. Yes, yes, yes. All right, so now let's move on to the part about how we can fix this, okay? Oh, I hope you're enjoying it. Let's take a look. First of all, obviously, if the origin of self-esteem is relational, a big part of the healing will also take place in the relational sphere. With this, I don't mean that everything depends on your relationships or that there's nothing you can do on an individual level. What I mean by this is that we have a perspective on self-esteem that's too individualistic, like do these exercises, do this with yourself. When really, and I'm sorry for how devastating what I'm about to say might be, no matter how much you work on having good self-esteem, on speaking to yourself better, on acquiring skills and so on, if you have crappy relationships, you're going to keep feeling like crap. That's just how it is. That's just how it is. Obviously, the more inner and solitary work you do, the easier it will be for you. Then you'll be able to choose better who to connect with, realize who yes, who no, when yes, when no, and how to handle it. But true transformation really comes not only when we've done the individual work, but also through the relationships we have in our daily lives. And it makes us feel valuable. In the end, as we've seen, relationships are one of the main contexts where self-esteem and identity are built, but also maintained. That is, self-esteem isn't something you build one day and then have it forever. It's something you're building every single day. It's a brick that you're laying every day. I mean, even if maybe because of how things were, your foundations are a little crooked. That's okay, it's not a big deal. Now you can redirect that, straighten it out, and decide where you want the building to keep growing. So there are a lot of things you can do in the present. So self-esteem isn't just something internal. It's not something that depends on what you do in your head, okay? It's constantly influenced by the relationships you have, okay? So I've included a few here, and I recommend you ask yourselves these when evaluating your relationships. Because when psychologists talk to you about what your relationships are like, the quality of the people you interact with, the quality of your relationships, we tend to think a lot about what the person we're interacting with is like, which is important in the sense of whether they're good to me, if they treat me well, if they're someone worthwhile. But it's also important, what are you like in that relationship? Who are you when you're with that person? Because there are people who, even if they're very good, very decent, can make your self-esteem improve or shrink. Okay, here are 4 questions for you to consider. The very first one is whether you can be vulnerable in that relationship. That is, can you let yourself be seen when you're not okay? Can you ask for help? Or do you get judgments, criticism, invalidation, and so on, right? No matter how good the person next to you is, if you can't show your vulnerability, in some way you're confirming that those parts of you have to remain split off. It's like somehow repeating that past experience that damaged your self-esteem. It's as if you were constantly confirming those pathological lessons about who you have to be and how you have to relate to others. Second question, can you be authentic in your relationships? That is, can you be yourself just as you are, spontaneously? Or do you have to hide parts of yourself, adapt, or even pretend to be someone else? This is very important. And many times we get tired in our daily lives and when we're with people because we're not being authentic. As someone in the chat rightly said, wearing a mask, not being authentic is something that is very exhausting. Just think that your brain has to constantly make a huge effort to hide, to show, to adapt, to read the other person. It's physiologically exhausting not to be authentic. So, well, not only do you improve your self-esteem, but you also improve your energy levels. There are so many people who are always exhausted and we only think about what we eat and how we sleep, but we don't think about, hey, am I being authentic? Or am I using up a lot of mental energy to wear this mask? The third part, of course, is reciprocity. I don't need to explain that, right? And hey, simply, do you feel more like yourself with that person or not? I mean, is it a relationship where you can allow yourself to bring back those parts of you that you've rejected, that you've pushed away, and that you've set aside? Because this is very key to building a solid and mature self-esteem. We can see it here, the integration of parts. Earlier we talked, right, about those parts of ourselves that we have extended, that we have set aside, that we have rejected, because we have learned that they won't be well received, they won't be valued, and that they will distance us from our relationships. Well, this, no matter how much we work on our self-esteem, no matter how many exercises we do, how much more kindly we speak to ourselves and so on, etc., we have to end up reintegrating these parts with ourselves. Look them in the eyes, accept them, understand them, embrace them, and show them in our relationships. That is, it's not enough to just stay at, yes, look, it's just that I learned back then not to show fear because when I showed fear, this or that would happen, and just stay there. No. It's not enough for us to understand it intellectually. You need to make sure that in your safe relationships, you can show your fear and you will still be loved. And you will still be accepted. Okay? This is very, very, very important. Very important. Work on self-esteem is done largely with others. And it's done by carefully choosing someone with whom you can bring to the present, to the stage, everything you once rejected about yourself. Because when you see with this person that part of you is acceptable, you will no longer experience that anxiety, that shame, and that crisis every time you fail. To push that part of yourself away. Yes? Let's pause to make sure this makes sense since it's important. It's very important. I'm glad it's clear. Great. What I want us to see is that self-esteem doesn't come when we manage to be perfect, when we manage to always be okay, when we've solved our insecurities, our weaknesses, etc. It appears when we stop considering them incompatible with our worth as people. When we see that those parts are well received in our relationships and that nothing bad happens when we integrate those parts, right? My mind is blown and it makes a lot of sense, but oh, I lost the comment. Yes, this is quite mind-blowing, but yes, I don't know if anyone has ever explained self-esteem to you this way. But it's very revealing and it's very healing. It truly changes your perspective. And there are many people who, for example, have experienced this with their partner, right? When they found someone who accepts them completely, who sees them, who understands them, who validates them, who welcomes them, and for the first time in their life, they've been able to show things they've always set aside, always hidden, always rejected. It can be a very healing experience, very healing. Let's dive a bit deeper into this. Okay. I really like to use the concept of a piggy bank for this, right? We can also see self-esteem as a piggy bank if we want, in the sense that it's not just something that was built one day, but it's something that day by day we keep collecting, we keep improving, and so on, right? All piggy banks can be more or less full of coins, of bills, right? And in this sense, for self-esteem, each coin is an action that you have carried out to, let's say, rewrite the story. Whenever you've accomplished something challenging, every time you have done something that challenged your usual defense mechanisms, right? Like we saw with arrogance, control, avoidance, and people-pleasing. Every time you have done something to step out of that character you built to protect yourself. Every time you have managed to show those parts of yourself that you had extended into your relationship, every time you have done one of these things, you add coins to your piggy bank and somehow you feel like you have more resources to invest. Let me explain. There are many people who are very afraid to take risks and to go for something because they feel that if they fail, somehow everything falls apart, right? Everything collapses, everything fails. Some people think, if I try this and it doesn't work out, that's fine. What's the difference between them? Well, one has her piggy bank full of coins and the other only has one or two little coins. So what happens? If I have very few coins and I take my coin and invest it in this, I'm going to be very anxious that this might go wrong. If I'm a person with very fragile self-esteem and I have very few coins, I would be very nervous about whether this kind of thing goes well or goes badly, because the result is going to influence too much how I'm going to feel about myself. On the other hand, since I've already taught a lot of classes, made a lot of YouTube videos, given talks, given conferences, things have gone well for me and so on. If this one doesn't go well for me, well, it's going to hurt, but I'm not going to fall apart either because I have a lot of coins in my piggy bank from previous times when I dared to try. So it's very interesting to look at it this way because it invites us in a way to break away from the usual patterns, to always fall into the same avoidances, the same defenses, into those things that make us feel safe in the short term, but in the long run affect our self-esteem. Yes? We all have limitations, difficulties, things that are hard for us. There are people who find it hard, I don't know, to confess to their partner that they're afraid of being abandoned. There are people who find it really hard to be spontaneous with their friends because they're very afraid that they'll see them as weird, criticize them, or judge them, right? We all have behaviors that limit us, right? Like we've been seeing throughout the class. And And we all end up avoiding rewriting the story, doing things differently because we're afraid of how we're going to feel. But when I don't dare, when I keep falling into the same avoidances as always, what I'm telling my brain is that I can't, that I'm not capable, that things are just like this, that if I ever try, something will go wrong, something will fail, I'm going to feel terrible. A silly example. Imagine that I'll give you a real example. When I started uploading videos to YouTube, I was really, really embarrassed. I had a really hard time. Every time I got in front of the camera, every time I had to talk, I did a bunch of different takes. I would stop, then start again. Well, it was a horrible experience for me. Why? Because I still felt very insecure in this area. So if something went wrong, it could be devastating for me. Today, if a video hardly gets any views, well, it doesn't bother me because I feel confident, right? In that sense. But why do I feel confident? Because I have proven to myself over and over again that I can do it. And how have I proven that to myself? By doing it, right? How often do people who wait to feel secure and to feel self-esteem with confidence before doing something when it actually works the other way around? By doing it, that's how you feel secure. And how do you feel with confidence, right? Self-concept isn't built from what you think about yourself. It's built from what you prove to yourself over and over again. And proving yourself isn't about achieving one result or another. Proving yourself it's daring to try and confirming that whether things go well or not, you're going to be okay with yourself. Okay? Let's see if this is making sense. I tried this myself and it's liberating. In the end, our brain is wired to avoid pain, to avoid what scares us, to avoid what's uncomfortable. We're wired to avoid. And avoidance is very tricky because in the short term, it gives us a sense of well-being, of relief. If that day I had said, you know what, I'm not going to make YouTube videos because they make me feel awful. Hey, well, I take a weight off my shoulders. It's wonderful. I feel super good. But in the medium term, besides the fact that I would have missed out on a lot of opportunities, in the long term, I've sent myself the message that I'm not capable of doing that. I have to hide because I don't have abilities, because I don't know how to communicate, because I'm not intelligent, because the world is bad, because people, right? I mean, everyone has their own issues. Every time we avoid something and feel good in the short term, in the long run, we're harming our self-esteem. And the more you harm your self-esteem, the fewer coins you have. And so you'll dare even less the next times, right? So sometimes people ask me, how do you dare to do this? Well, because I've dared to do it other times, right? You said a really great phrase and I wanted to write it down just as it is. I don't know what I said, I'm sorry. So each imitation becomes information that you give your brain about your identity, about your self-esteem, right? When you have to rewrite the story, break out of patterns, and so on, don't just think about what you're doing in the moment. Think about how it's going to impact your self-esteem in the long run. Everything we do has consequences. Here, it's like there's someone here who's always watching what you do and taking notes. And based on what you do, they take notes and build a library of who you are, what you can do, what you can't do, what the world is like, what people are like, right? And again, these little coins aren't earned through achievements. You earn these little coins simply by facing things, by breaking away from the past, by stepping out of your comfort zone, by being consistent, right? For example, if you're very afraid of getting close to someone and getting hurt, and one day you say, look, I want to stop being like this all the time. I want to give love another chance. I'm going to try. You enter a relationship and get hurt by the other person. It doesn't matter if things didn't go well because you did your part by coming out of that defensive mode, right? By stepping out of your defensive isolation and emotional disconnection, You've already earned your little coin. You've shown yourself you're capable. Okay? I'm going to turn on another light here because it's getting dark. Too much light. Isn't there a dimmer light? Okay. Let's keep using the little coins metaphor. Besides, it's very important that we dare to collect more little coins so that later, when we have to invest those coins in something difficult, we don't feel so anxious and fragile. It's also important that we diversify these investments, right? If anyone here has ever invested, you'll know that if you put all your money into a single investment, well, besides being much riskier, you're always stressed and anxious about what will happen with that investment, right? A similar thing happens with self-esteem. When you put all your little coins of self-esteem into a single area, if something happens in life, it completely breaks you down. You will relate to that area in a very anxious, very watchful, very tense way. I'll give several examples. There are many women, obviously, because of the social influence we have and so on, who base too much of how they feel about themselves on their physical appearance, right? They invest too much mental energy, time, resources, whatever it may be, into their physical appearance. What happens then? Hey, maybe they enhance it, they feel a little better about it, but what happens then? Since it's their only source of value, they're always hypervigilant, constantly monitoring their appearance and placing excessive demands on themselves, right? And that's why it's so important to diversify. There are many girls who ask me, how can I make my physical appearance less important to me? Well, the best way isn't to focus so much on working on your relationship with your physical appearance, but rather to find other sources of self-esteem, right? Invest in other areas of your life that also give you self-esteem and confidence. I mean, how could you not be obsessed with your physical appearance if there's absolutely nothing else in your life that makes you feel valuable? It's normal to develop an anxious, obsessive, and toxic relationship with your physical appearance if it's your only source of self-esteem reinforcement, right? When you work on this, you notice how some girls start to feel valuable because of their knowledge, their personality, their career, their relationship, the hobby they're good at, sports, and so on. When we start to build other pillars, the relationship with physical appearance changes a lot because it's no longer so dependent on it. Also, for example, you can see it with people who may have placed too much of their self-esteem in their work achievements, right? Well, as long as that's going well, great, although there is probably an unhealthy pattern of work addiction, obsession, anxiety, and so on. But imagine that then there's a bankruptcy and you get fired. You don't have other pillars to support your self-esteem and your identity, so you're completely lost, you fall apart, right? That's why I think I like this class, because I've included a lot of visual metaphors, and I think that in this way, my perspective on self-esteem is better integrated. If your self-esteem depends on just one area, you experience it with a lot of fragility, because then any threat in that area, anything that goes even a little bit wrong, feels like a threat to your whole self. Whereas if you've invested your little coins in different areas, you're chill. Other areas in your life support you, right? It's like that little trivial pursuit pie, right? Well, you have to try to fill in all the areas and not depend on just one, okay? So here I'm going to give you a little bit to think about and what I consider is fundamental for us to work on for good self-esteem. As we've seen, it's not something rational. It's not something you work on with your thoughts. It's something experiential, what I do day to day, and it's relational, how I relate to other people, right? Here are what I see as the 4 pillars of self-esteem. Emotional regulation, in the sense of allowing yourself to relate to all your parts without rejecting them, without denying them, without judging them, without swinging back and forth, without deceiving yourself. Safe relationships, secure bonds where you can be yourself, where you can show your vulnerability and where you can reveal all those parts of yourself that you had rejected and see that they are valid. Third, coherent action. Look, I want to improve this about myself. I want to improve this part of my life. I face discomfort. I don't avoid it. I don't hide. I dare to do it. and I add this little coin to my piggy bank. And the integration we discussed earlier, being able to bring together inside yourself that strong part, that vulnerable part, that capable part, that part with limitations, right? To integrate the fact that I have good things and bad things in quotes, because none is really good and none is really bad, but to integrate within myself that which has been reinforced and that which has been rejected, right? So in the end, mature self-esteem is being able to be imperfect without ceasing to feel worthy. I think that's a good phrase. To be able to be imperfect without ceasing to feel worthy. And here, as a conclusion, the distinction again between that false or fragile or conditional self-esteem and that real self-esteem. And here we have it, right? At the top, that social conception we have of self-esteem as the need to always be on top, to always be up, to feel secure, to feel confident, that I don't care what others say, that, I feel great, I feel strong, right? And how many mechanisms, right, that we've seen actually make things worse and come from trying to always be on top, right? That counterphobic attitude to avoid admitting that I'm vulnerable, that I'm afraid, that split where I don't want to accept that there are parts of me that make me uncomfortable or that have been rejected, that ideal selfie I have to achieve to feel loved, that narcissism, right, of denying my vulnerability and my feelings of inferiority. All those mechanisms come from thinking that self-esteem means being on top, right? Like this wave of thinking that we have to be on top all the time. That person who feels they have to be strong, stand out, be liked, be perfect, deny their flaws, their limitations, right? That's a lost battle from the start. Because life inevitably includes mistakes, unexpected events, losses, limitations, failures, moments of vulnerability, and periods of suffering. That's why, in the end, I really want you to remember that self-esteem. Oh, I'm out of breath. Mature self-esteem doesn't mean eliminating vulnerability, getting rid of what we don't like, or having a false, idealized, superior, or improved image of ourselves. What really defines mature self-esteem is allowing ourselves to go through those experiences, to integrate those parts we don't like without losing our connection with ourselves, right? It's realizing that even when the wave isn't at its peak, there's still ground underneath, firm, holding everything together and giving continuity to our identity and our self. Okay? What did you think? Improving self-esteem isn't about making sure the wave is always up. It's about discovering that beneath the wave, there's solid ground. And you build that solid ground through everything we've seen today in class. So, well, tell me in the chat what has impacted you the most today. What is the biggest lesson you're taking away? What did you like the most? What impacted you the most? Seems like nothing specific, just a bit of everything. I have more self-esteem than I thought. I like that comment, Carmen, because that's what I said at the start of class. There are people who think they have low self-esteem when it's simply part of being human to have insecurities, have a few hang-ups, and have flaws or limitations in some areas. It's like somehow we've labeled the experience of being human as having low self-esteem, and we even label things that are actually low self-esteem as having good self-esteem, right? So, well, it's very interesting. Very interesting. I invite you to watch the class a couple more times because I know it was a bit dense. I know you need to understand a lot of things in order to understand others later. So I invite you to watch it several times, okay? Of course, also, as we know, no matter how much you know the theory of something, it's not enough. Otherwise, all psychologists would always be fine, right? In every way. You have to put it into practice, you have to integrate it, you have to reflect on it, and you have to keep working on it, right? In fact, someone in the chat said that they really liked it, but they think there are still things they need to understand. And obviously, that's why we have the Mindhunt Academy platform, my online psychology academy, which is for continuing to go deeper and keep learning about psychology, both in a theoretical and a practical way. So from now on, I'm going to explain a little bit about what the academy is, just in case anyone wants to join, if anyone really wants to keep learning psychology, wants to keep training, and wants to apply all of this in a practical way to their life. The class is already over, so if anyone wants to leave, you can go now. It's true that at the end, we will answer questions and any doubts about the class. Now I'll explain what this space is, since today's class was more theoretical and dense. And well, in the end, YouTube is more about entertainment. If someone really wants to learn psychology, that's why I created the academy, okay? So, well, I'm going to tell you what Mind Hunt Academy is about. In case you didn't know, as you know, Mindhunt Academy comes from the idea of stopping being prey to our mind and becoming the hunter instead, right? That is to stop feeling like our mind has control over our life and start to understand it, comprehend it, and make it our ally. That's where it comes from. That's where the name comes from. Well, in the end, a lot of people used to ask me when I made videos on YouTube, and they still ask me, Claudia, where can I learn psychology? Because I'm really interested in it, both to learn about it and to apply it to my life. But I can't find books, I can't find places, and the psychology degree really isn't useful for this interest. And that's why I created Mind Hunt Academy for all the people who want to learn psychology, whether to apply it to their work life, their personal life, or just to learn psychology, because I find it fascinating to understand how the human mind works. All right? There's a lot of emotional transformation, but it doesn't replace therapy. That's not the goal. But by learning psychology, you can understand many things about yourself, about your relationships, make better decisions, relate better to yourself, learn to regulate yourself emotionally, understand what your purpose is, take actions that are in line with what you want and who you want to be. Really, many people sign up because they want to learn, and in the end, they report great changes in their self-esteem, emotional regulation, self-knowledge, and relationships. Many people have made important changes in their lives, and honestly, it's really cool, right? How does it work? It's a bit like a Netflix for psychology. You log in, and there are already quite a few classes on different topics that are already recorded. You have access to more than 100 classes, and you can watch the topics that interest you. Are you interested in lie detection? Well, there you have it. Interested in psychopathology and disorders? There you have it. How about self-esteem, relationship psychology, or neuroscience? There are different categories where you can watch pre-recorded classes. But also, of course, we continue to give live classes every week. Expert psychologists from various fields come, since I'm only an expert in my areas and know little about others. This year, several teachers will talk to us about neurodivergence, which I know nothing about, even though some have suggested I might be neurodivergent. Still, I don't know much about it. Well, we have psychologists from different fields, and I also do live analyses every month in the academy. We have psychological cases, like watching an episode of a series or something like that, and we analyze it on the spot to practically apply what we've learned in class. Here we have some of the psychologists from different fields. Well, in the end, psychology is very broad, and it's best for each person to come specialized in that area and with experience in that field. Because we're not here to bring fluff, filler content, or to talk about things you can find on the internet. I mean, here we bring things that come from years of study and professional experience.
Hi, I'm Deborah Murcia, a professor at the Mindhunt Academy in the Psychology of Narcissism, Abuse, and Trauma. And I'm making this video to thank both the Academy and Claudia for trusting me. I wanted to express that out of all the projects I've collaborated on, this is one of the best because both Claudia and the entire team behind Mindhunt work very hard to provide the quality service. They are very approachable, very empathetic, very warm people, and they make the work very enjoyable. On the other hand, I also want to mention that they are people who work very hard to provide quality service to all the students, so that the people who learn at Mindhunt gain knowledge based on science, but also that it's practical, that it's useful for them, that it helps them, and that they can apply it in their daily lives. That's why this is one of the best academies I've found so far, and I'm so happy and satisfied to be part of this project.
Well, you can see that we have very good reviews on Trustpilot, which is something that people leave on their own and can't be changed because this was really created with a purpose. Well, authentic and genuine so that people can learn, understand themselves, and improve. I honestly feel sorry that so many people don't understand how their mind works and that they go through life confused, not understanding what's happening, making mistakes that could be avoided. And I think that if everyone knew psychology, not only would there be less suffering and people would be happier, but we would also have a better world. And I think that changing the world starts, right, by changing yourself. And I believe that learning psychology is key to that. So, well, the reason things are done well at the Academy is because it serves a genuine purpose. So, well, we have a platform where you can not only watch live and recorded classes, but you can also interact with other people who share your interests and more. As soon as you join, we have a system to welcome you and explain how everything works, which class we recommend you start with, and so on. Because in the end, it's important for you to learn some concepts, right? So that later you can go deeper and move up to higher levels. In the end, we've been doing this for 4 years and we have more basic classes as well as advanced ones so that anyone can learn, right? We have a community and more than 5,000 students have already gone through the academy. And well, there are also a lot of people who, have met friends, have met people with whom they can share interests, hobbies, and concerns. They organize meetups, and sometimes some couples come out of it too, so it's quite interactive and nice, right? Every week, we either have a live class or an analysis session with me, or we also have a student meetup to share as well, right? How they're feeling, how they're progressing, what they've learned, what has caught their attention. We bring up a topic in what we call mind handbrake and discuss it. For example, recently we've talked about manipulation. We've also talked about comparing ourselves to other people. And it's actually a really nice gathering. We also hold in-person events with the students and others, which are a lot of fun. Those who have been there already know what we do. The Mind Hand Breaks, we also do weekly challenges for self-awareness, for anyone who wants to put exercises and so on into practice, those little coins, right? The ones we talked about earlier for the piggy bank. And also for everyone who joins before summer, we've prepared something really cool, totally free, which is what we've called Summer from Within. It's a 1-month program aimed at improving self-esteem for the summer in different areas. You'll see everyone who joins with exercises, with a live session, with a psychologist who specializes in body image and self-esteem as well. And well, it's a really cool program where you can also choose what is, let's say, your main concern about your self-esteem as summer approaches. And you can find people who have chosen that same concern so you can support each other in that sense. And of course, it also includes self-esteem classes. The price? How much does all this cost? Okay, other academies I've seen charge about 70 euros a month, and what they offer are 2 workshops. This doesn't cost nearly that much. It also doesn't cost what a standard therapy session does. That's quite a bit more, because we believe, as I said, that these tools should be accessible to everyone. Obviously, we can't work for free because things cost money. We have to pay employees, the platform, all of that. We have to make a living. But we can make the prices quite affordable. And in fact, everyone who joins the academy tells us that the value it offers and what you learn is way above the price you pay. So, well, if you join annually, which is how most people do it because it's the most convenient and economical, it costs 24 euros a month, which I think is about the same as Netflix or Spotify, I'm not sure, or YouTube, the subscription, I'm not really sure. But anyway, 24 euros a month for 2 live classes, an analysis with me, the community, challenges, exercises, and the self-esteem program in the summer. And all the recorded classes from the past 4 years where honestly you learn a lot. You learn a lot. And I learn from other teachers. I mean, there are quite a few things that I learn in the classes. I learn at my academy because psychologists from unfamiliar fields visit. So Just so you see, there are people in the academy who, after years there, have extensive knowledge of psychology and know things that many psychologists don't know. So very soon we will raise the price, and that's it. So you have this option here to join with this summer gift we've given you from the program. Here you have everything you get, which is a lot. And well, really, those who join notice the difference in their relationships, in their self-esteem, in their work life, in their satisfaction with life. Well, in general, it's a powerful change. And I'm the first person whose life has changed a lot. And how she feels about herself has changed a lot, as well as how she feels about life, about the world, about people. And that's been thanks to learning psychology. Just to show how confident we are in what we do. You can join for 2 weeks, and if you don't like it, we'll give you your money back. And also, we've added a guarantee that if after 8 months, obviously, if you've attended classes for at least 2 hours a week, if you see that it hasn't given you anything, that you haven't learned, that you haven't improved, we'll also give you your money back. Because we're so sure about what we're offering. That's a really good message. So that's it. Here's the QR code for you to join. And well, this is also important. Although as more content is added and the years go by, the price goes up. But for those who join, well, their price stays the same forever when they renew. So that's it. Until June 21st, you have this offer, with everything included from the summer program, from the inside, and the current price. Here is the QR code.